I can't believe I just marked the 1-year anniversary of launching my own private practice. I was worried about the headaches of doing billing and documentation all on my own without any administrative support. But it turns out with Simple Practice, the paperwork is easier than I ever expected. Simple Practice is an all-in-one EHR that is HIPAA compliant, high trust certified, and built specifically for therapists. One of my favorite features is how effortless it is to create super bills for my clients so they can get reimbursed quickly. Simple Practice helps me focus on what I love most, working with clients, by lightening up the business side of running my own practice. And if you're just starting out or growing your practice, they also have a credentialing service that helps you get paneled independently. It takes the total headache out of insurance enrollment, giving you full autonomy over your own contracts without any middleman platforms taking a cut. If you are ready to simplify the business side of your practice, now is a great time to try Simple Practice. Start with a 7-day free trial, then get 50% off your first 3 months. Just go to simplepractice.com to claim the offer. Again, that's simplepractice.com.
Similarities help us get to know somebody and help us feel good with somebody, but it's the differences that really help us grow. I just love that idea, and I think it's so true with neurodiverse relationships.
That was Cindy Ariel on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, author of Act for Burnout and Act Daily Journal.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and the author of an upcoming book on developing your confidence and social skills.
From Boston, I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, faculty at Brown University and author of Work, Parent, Thrive, and Why Don't You Understand Me?
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
If you hit play on an episode about how humans bond, congratulations, you're a relationship nerd. Welcome, you are among friends. And since you are my people, a quick note. My new book, Why Don't You Understand Me, is out October 27th and is available for pre-order now. Pre-order and let me know, and I'll send you some bonuses as a thank you. Order 12 or more copies for a book club, a workshop, a therapist training, and I'll join you on a Zoom for a 30-minute mini workshop or Q&A. That's right, I can be bought. Link in the show notes.
Hey listeners, just a super quick reminder that you can listen to the podcast ad-free by supporting us on Patreon for just $5 a month. Or you can support the podcast with a one-time donation on Buy Me a Coffee. Thank you to everyone who's already supporting us.
Welcome, listeners, to an introduction to this episode. I'll be interviewing author Cindy Ariel about what it's like to be in relationships with people who are quite different from us. And one thing before we dive into that content is that I wanted to announce to and Michael, I know you had a chance to listen to this conversation. I'm curious what your thoughts were.
You asking me to do this discussion with you is very serendipitous to me because over the last couple of days, maybe 2 weeks, I've been reaching out to friends and colleagues that I have to ask them questions about autism in adults. And the reason I was doing that was that I, over the last couple of months, had the realization or the very strong intuition that my dad most likely has undiagnosed autism. And this is only something that I've picked up on maybe a year or two since I've been on the podcast here and heard colleagues and guests talk about autism and autism in adulthood and so on, that a couple of dots connected. And I thought, wait a second, this describes a lot about how my dad interacts with me. My dad is like amazing and I love my dad. We have so much fun. And also the more I've become an independent adult, the more there's been clashes and misunderstanding and conflict to a point where I often found myself furious or insulted or just not comfortable at all until this realization came along that what I'm probably dealing with here is a relationship with a dear loved one who is most likely autistic. And so now Yael comes along and sends me a link to this interview and asked me if I were to do the discussion with her. And this was like, this was serendipity. And now I know that my situation here is different than what you discuss with your guest, because this is about couples and where one of the partners is autistic. But I still felt that maybe we have something to discuss here.
Totally. And while this episode, it has some specificity about intimate relationships where one partner has autism, I do think that the implications are really far-reaching. And in fact, my book is very broad-based. And I felt like it was really, really parallel, because the idea that you're talking about is how frustrating it is to be in a close relationship with somebody whose brain works really differently. And the thing about that, and Cindy talks about this too, is that like our brains are on a spectrum of similar and difference, but the reality is in no close relationship do two people have the exact same brain, right? We do not relate only to ourselves. We relate to other people who have brains that will work differently. And recognizing that it's not malicious, it's just two brains moving through the world differently gives you some level of acceptance, but also understanding how their brain tends to work, how they tend to see things, gives you a better position from which to relate. Because you can be like, oh, like that's not important to them. Their brain doesn't make much of it. Whereas my brain says, oh, this is so important. This is a difference between the two of us. And it gives you a different way to understand them and to understand the differences between you that I think is a lot less frustrating, because you don't see intent behind it. You can just see it as a fundamental difference, but also gives you a way to collaborate. Hey, you do it this way, I do it this way, but we're in a relationship. How can we collaborate? So this episode is not just for couples. I do think that there's a lot of insights that you might have in any kind of close relationship with somebody who has a very different brain than you do. My guest today has spent over 3 decades at the intersection of psychology, neurodiversity, and intimate relationships, which, as anyone who's ever tried to connect with another human being knows, is some of the most complex territory there is. Dr. Cindy Ariel is a Philadelphia-based psychologist, one of the founders of Alternative Choices, a practice known for its work with LGBTQ families and individuals on the autism spectrum, and the author of several books on neurodivergent relationships, including her newest book, Autism and the Two of Us, which I'm so excited to talk about with her today. She's been doing this work since before most people had a framework for thinking about autism in adults, and she's here today to talk about what it looks like when neurodivergence shows up in our closest relationships. Cindy, welcome.
Thank you. That was such a great introduction.
I am really so excited to talk with you today because in my couples therapy practice, I see a lot of couples where one partner is neurodiverse. And a lot of how you describe helping people in close relationships also aligns with what I discuss in my book, which is called Why Don't You Understand Me?, which is about how people struggle to understand one another in close relationships. So even though you're discussing a particular case of neurodivergence, autism, I think a lot of the lessons that you share in your book apply far more broadly, even with close relationships between people who have quite similar brains.
Yeah, they definitely do. In fact, first of all, it sounds like your book. I need to read it. It sounds very similar to what I'm talking about. The whole thing is about understanding people, any people who are different than you, which is probably all the people.
Exactly. I mentioned this before we started recording, but there's some fundamental truth that we're all kind of quirky. We're all different than one another. We don't partner with ourselves. And so by necessity, we're partnering with somebody who has a different brain than we do.
Right. And I wanted them to know that this book was for them too, even though it's for everybody,
Absolutely.
But specifically for neurodiverse couples and even more specifically, autistic.
Yes. So there's a lot to get into, and I wanted to actually start with some definitions, with the basic definitions, because I think there's more confusion than people realize. So I wonder if you can start us off with a broad-based definition of autism and of neurodiversity. And then also I have this question that you address directly in your book, which is what language should we try to be using, as in person first or identity first?
Wow, those are good questions. So autism, the way I see it, is a neurological difference. Some people call it a syndrome or a disorder. I just see it as a difference. It's a difference in the way the brain works. And there's specific differences because when your brain is wired in a certain way, it affects every single thing you do. So if you're autistic, you're going to think differently, see differently, perceive differently, feel differently. Everything is different because your wiring is different. So that's autism. And neurodiversity, I think that was the second word to define. And I think the definitions in my book are kind of wordy, but neurodiversity is really just all the differences of all the brains. There's so much neurodiversity everywhere. Nobody thinks exactly alike. Nobody's brain is exactly alike. If your brain is a certain degree of neurodiverse, then you are neurodivergent. And then there's a diagnosis for that, like ADHD or OCD or autistic, things like that. But neurodiversity is really just about the differences of all of us. Just like our skin colors and eye colors and all the things about us are different, our brains are different too.
Absolutely. I'm just pulling up this quote that I have from Temple Grandin, who is a renowned animal behavior scientist and autism advocate. Mm-hmm. And I love this one quote from her book about the differences between herself and neurotypical people and recognizing that everybody is looking at the world through very different sets of eyes, or I should say through very different kinds of brains. And then she comments, the world needs all kinds of minds. That's just a really beautiful way to kind of capture something that is more extremely represented in people with autism versus who don't have autism, that we have different brains. But again, as you're saying, like that's true regardless of the diagnosis. We all have different brains.
Yeah. And along with what Temple says, when a neurodiverse couple, when your brains are so different, you even have more opportunities for how you get along and how you see the world. And things are really different and really unique and special.
Yeah. I love that you made that point in the book, is that we don't need to see the differences as being something to be afraid of or concerned about, that there's actually a lot of beauty and we can kind of harness those differences for good, for connection, for perspective. And so we're going to talk a bit about the benefits of different brains in close relationship. But before we get there, I wanted to ask you this question, because there's this persistent assumption that autistic people can't be in close relationships, or that our neurotypical autistic pairing is inherently doomed. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on where that myth comes from and what does your clinical experience actually show?
Well, I think it comes from misunderstanding completely. I see that autistic people can do really great in relationships. Just like neurotypical people, they're better in relationships with autistic people sometimes than they are with neurotypical people because they understand each other better. But I like the idea that similarities help us get to know somebody and help us feel good with somebody, but it's the differences that really help us grow. I just love that idea, and I think it's so true with neurodiverse relationships.
I always think about differences in the figure of yin and yang, which is like when we have something different to press up against, we can create a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts, right? If we're only light and we never have darkness, then that's such a limited experience. But that pressure between the two sides keeps things in balance, but also creates like this larger harmony and opportunity to access a much richer, fuller existence.
As long as the pressure's not too forceful.
Exactly. And we're going to talk a little bit about like, how do you know when the pressure is too forceful? Because you address that so beautifully in your book. But I want to sort of bring another quote that is from your book, because you write that the typical ways of loving must be redefined for success in a neurodiverse partnership. And I'm curious how you see that redefinition look like in practice.
That actually looks different to everybody. And that's the point, that a lot of partners come in and they're very upset that their autistic partner doesn't do things the way everybody else does, the way their friends do, their family does, their friends' partners do. And they want them to do it in a certain way. And they may do it, but in a totally different way. And that has to be understood. And that's important for their bonding and their whole union.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, to your point of everybody has to define it differently, I think that's right. The sort of theme throughout this is that like everybody is different. Everybody's got their human quirks, and that the point is not to look for somebody who doesn't have differences, but to try to find ways to bridge across that, what can be more fodder for misunderstanding when our differences are more significant.
Yes, it's funny. That's one of the things that the book does boil down to. Like most self-help books, it can sometimes boil down to 3 bullet points. That's a big one. So a lot of the book is just making sure people really get that. We can't assume that there's one right way of doing things, even one right way of having a romantic relationship or dating or living together. There's as many right ways as there are people. Yeah. And, some couples, you see some couples and you're like, oh, they should have got divorced 20 years ago. Why are they together? But actually, if they're together at whatever that is, that's working for them. So who are we to say?
I love that. Right. That it's kind of up to each individual and each couple to decide for themselves what's workable and what isn't workable.
And we're not talking about someone who we see like keep going back to someone who's abusive or that kind of thing. I mean, that's a whole nother ballgame.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But sometimes people are just nitpicky with each other or they're bickering, all this stuff in it. That's just how they do.
Right. Like there are some couples for whom having sexual intimacy, not that important, or, dividing household chores more equitably, not that important. And then there's some people who need to talk every day and some people who don't really need to interact that much and it's comfortable for them. And to your point, it's sort of like figuring out for you what's your bottom line, and if your partner can meet you somewhere in the vicinity, and if you can create a culture within your relationship where enough of your needs are met that it feels satisfying. And that really is something that each couple needs to figure out for themselves. And one of the things that I really love about your book, and I hope to pull out a few examples, is that at the beginning of each chapter, you have like, here's something that a neurotypical person would think, and here's something that an autistic person would think. And, one of them might be something like, I try so hard, I'm always working for my partner in my relationship. And it might be the autistic person. And the neurotypical person might think, it never seems like my partner is trying to contribute or show me love and care. And so I wonder, how do you help two partners who have like a pretty big understanding gap in what is appropriate to expect in a close relationship?
Usually these are people who do love and care for each other. That's why they're coming, right? Because they want to find that again. So I find out how this person is expressing their love and care. So, for example, I saw a couple recently who the woman was deciding to change her job and look for a new job. And she felt like her partner was just not supporting her at all in that, just not caring. And this was in a session, and he was like dumbfounded. Like, what? I helped you research all these other jobs. I told you like I'd be willing to move. I did a spreadsheet for you about the pros and cons. And she was like, but you didn't talk to me about how I was feeling about, I'm scared to change my job, and the emotional piece that she was looking for. But But for her, learning that, oh, that's what he was doing when he was doing those things, it just changes a person's mindset. I mean, sometimes they still say, yeah, but I still want you to do that. But a lot of times they're like, oh, I didn't realize that's what you were thinking when you were doing that.
So in a sense, it's like figuring out what each person needs, but also figuring out how to understand the signals that each person sends, because they might be signaling in a different language. It is like, it's not exactly love languages, but I'm just thinking like if one person sort of signals, here's me caring for you and showing love by making a spreadsheet, and the other person's looking for conversation, they may each feel the other person's not sort of reading them right. But if you can understand, oh, that's how I communicate love and care, I can receive that in the way it was intended. But it's that understanding of like, what are the signals and how to read them.
Mm-hmm. And then also teaching the other person. I mean, they could listen, they could ask questions. That doesn't come natural. It wasn't their first thought. Their first thought was spreadsheet. But they'll do different. They just maybe have to be asked or told or.
Absolutely. This is actually a question I was going to ask later, but if one person is really craving like, hey, I know it's not your first instinct. Your first instinct is to do a spreadsheet, but what would really make me feel loved is to have a hug or to have a conversation where you ask me about my feelings, and that we can learn to do more of that. The one thing that correct me if this is wrong, but I think rigidity is a bit of one of the core attributes for folks who meet criteria for autism. And so one of the challenges that I see clinically is that for the person with the diagnosis, asking for those accommodations or those skills to be built over time is sometimes extremely challenging and sometimes not possible for the person with autism. And so that then means that the neurotypical partner may not be able to get some of those needs met. And I'm just curious how you handle situations like that, where there is rigidity in what one partner, and it could go in either direction, when what one partner wants from the other that would require a bit of like growth or flexibility.
Right. So that's absolutely true. Autistic people sometimes have a harder time with change. At the same time, it's an interesting slip that you made, because in that scenario that you described, we could say that the neurotypical person is also being rigid because they're insisting they have to have that thing that is really hard for the autistic person to give them. So who should move and why?
Yes, you make that good point. And I totally did make that slip, where there's this expectation that a neurotypical person's needs are sort of worthy of being met, even if the autistic person.
Like they have to be.
Yeah.
And the autistic person is being rigid because they can't do it. And the neurotypical person is being rigid in their insistence that they do.
Yeah.
And sometimes that is an impasse, and that's really hard. Sometimes it has to be some third kind of way.
When you say a third kind of way, what kinds of solution spaces have you arrived at with the couples you work with?
Sometimes the third kind of way surprises me, and I think, wow, I don't know that I could do that, So I was talking to a couple about Valentine's Day, because the autistic person in this couple hates Valentine's Day. Not for them at all. They don't get anything out of it. But the typical person, has some really specific things. You're supposed to get a card. You're supposed to get flowers, and you're supposed to go out to dinner. Like, this is what you're supposed to do. And the autistic one is just like, I don't want to go out, stand in line, flower, So they came up with this. Part of what they came up with was they were going to go on Sunday when they go to the market anyway, whatever day Valentine's Day is, doesn't matter. The Sunday before, they're going to pick out flowers at the market so that there's flowers on Valentine's Day. Now, not every couple would agree that that's a good solution. And I had to ask this person, like, is that really okay with you? Oh, yeah, absolutely. I just want flowers. This is really fine. I'd be so happy. Like, okay, great. So it's not always what you think or what might work for you. It's like they had to come up with that.
Yeah. Your example brings me to another topic that you discuss in your book, which is that in our neurotypical world, that we have all sorts of formal and informal social rules and expectations. Valentine's Day, right? We get a card and chocolate and flowers. That's sort of like we buy into that cultural expectation and that social expectation. And that part of what happens in the kind of relationships that you're describing in the book is that you have one partner who sort of has adopted a lot of those rules and just kind of accepts them as like fundamental, and one person who doesn't. And so I was just curious, what are some examples of social rules that trip neurodiverse couples up in your experience?
There's so many of them. I mean, some of the more common is like going out to a party and one wants to go and one doesn't want to go. And then they have to figure out like, okay, if we are going to go, what are the rules? Can I leave early? Can I just go in the other room and hide for half an hour? Do I have to go at all? Or can I have my phone? Is there an exit plan? That's usually pretty important. And in the exit plan, do we both have to leave together, or can just one of us go? Would that be okay? And you have to work that out. And sometimes it's okay, and sometimes it's not okay, because, with the family, maybe the family understands. Or maybe if it's grandmom, she doesn't understand. We have to do something else when we go to her. It's just very complicated. You have to figure out all these things.
Yeah, so there's some of these outside of the house. And I was also thinking about in a generic interaction that I might expect that in a pause after I've told a story that the other person would make a comment on the story, and that somebody who is autistic, or honestly, somebody who just isn't as verbal, might just quietly listen, and they're paying attention and they're absorbing and they're interested, but they might not engage. And my informal rule of like, we engage with one another. There's a reciprocity of like, I say something and you comment on it. Then I ask you about your thing. And to me, I think that this can be like more intense in couples who are neurodiverse within the couple. But I think it's one of these things that shows up in lots of couples where like we just have different expectations for everyday interactions.
Sure. So sometimes that's a gender thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not always, but yeah. And with neurodiverse couples, a lot of times one person likes to talk, or you're watching TV together and somebody wants to comment, or someone wants to even discuss the show afterwards. And the other person is like, I just want to process it. I just watched the thing. I don't want to talk about it.
I already connected with you over it. I sat next to you.
Yeah, we did that together. We spent the whole night together. And the other one's like, we were not together at all. Although we were next to each other.
And I want to sort of like pause on that, because what you just said is such a great example of like of how misunderstanding happens, because you have two people sitting side by side watching a show, and one of them is thinking, we're not even interacting. Like, I don't feel close at all. This is like parallel play. Whereas the other one's like, we've spent all night together. We've engaged. We're having an experience together. I feel so connected. And like that can both be true. And what gets so complicated is when one person wants the other person to like buy into their experience and sort of agree with them that is what was the case. And the other is like, that's not what I experienced at all.
Yeah. There's that full experiential difference. And they are both true. That's what you said. They're both true at the same time. Always. They're both right.
There's often two totally different experiences happening side by side. And that might be especially stark with somebody who is autistic and somebody who is not. But it's just generally true. And so part of what you're teaching couples in your work with them is to recognize that both experiences are legitimate, even though they're totally different. And to teach them to express that to one another. Hey, I had a different experience, but that doesn't mean that yours is invalid. In fact, they're both valid.
Right. And then maybe working out a way that the person who didn't feel connected at all, maybe they can do a little something about that sometimes.
Yeah. Well, and that gets me to this pivot on the golden rule that you offer in your book, which is to treat your partner how they want to be treated rather than how you want to be treated. And I'm curious how you help couples learn what that looks like for one another.
Well, what we were just talking about is a good start to that, because they begin to realize, oh, we have such different ways of looking at things, and they want their partner to feel good. So they want to give them what they want. They just never thought of that. You know, we all think about what we would want. That's a whole thing. You know, when people get sick, some people really want the partner to, you know, like, why don't they come in, see how I'm doing? Where their partner would totally want to be left alone. Please don't come in and see how I'm doing. Leave me alone. I'm sleeping, you know, or I don't feel good. So learning to leave your partner alone if that's what they want, or if they want hourly checks, make sure you do that. It's learning what people want. And you don't always know, even with neurotypical people, you don't know what they want. And we assume so much of that.
Yes, we make so many assumptions. I think that is evident. And I mean, in a way, I think one of the gifts of having a couple with brains that are so different that you kind of know that there shouldn't be assumptions is there's even more opportunity to be like, what did you expect? Or what is it that you want? Whereas, you know, one of the biases that I'm really interested in is something called closeness communication bias. And what research has found is that in close relationship, we assume that people with friends, with partners, we assume that people's brains and the way that they define words is more similar to us than it actually is. Whereas we're less likely to make that assumption with a stranger. And we might also be less likely to make that with somebody who we know their brain just works differently and may hopefully be more motivated to check out those assumptions. Well, what do you think? How do you define that?
Yeah, it's a really good point that neurodiverse couples are so different that it's easier to point that out.
Yeah.
And the assumptions are even broader in some ways when it's two typical people and then they both really expect that they should be thinking alike, which they still aren't.
Exactly. Yeah. Who else feels like August is the Sunday of summer? It's the perfect time to hit reset before the autumn rush. And for me, that always starts with my wardrobe. Quince proves you don't need a crowded closet to look incredible. You just need the right pieces. Quince specializes in effortless, high-quality essentials like ultra-soft organic cotton and premium Mongolian cashmere sweaters. They're beautifully tailored, built to last, and transition seamlessly from morning meetings to dinner. Everything at Quince is priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. They work directly with ethical factories and cut out the middlemen, so you're paying for quality, not brand markup. I have several pieces from Quince, including my aviator glasses, a bohemian skirt, and a woven purse that I reach for over and over again. And it's not just apparel. Quince also brings that same everyday elevation to everything they offer, from hotel quality bedding and bath to kitchen staples, essentials, and thoughtfully designed furniture. Upgrade your everyday. Download the Quince app for app-exclusive offers or go to quince.com/POTC. Get free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada and the UK too. That's QUINCE.com/POTC.
Sleep Number's new collections are designed to adapt to the changing nature of your life and your sleep needs. Whether it's the personalized comfort of the new Comfort Mode mattress, the targeted pressure relief of the Comfort Next mattress, or the Climate Collection that actively cools or warms to help you fall asleep and stay asleep.
And now, get early access to our biggest sale of the year. Save 25% on the new Comfort Next Luxe for a limited time. Only at a Sleep Number store or sleepnumber.com.
One other area that I think comes up a lot in couples therapy that you touch on in your book is sexual intimacy. I mean, I think this comes back to another myth, which is, you know, people who have autism aren't that interested in sexual intimacy, right? Kind of goes back to that original myth of thinking that autistic people aren't interested in close relationships. And you bust that myth. And I wonder if you can share a bit with our audience where the truth lies.
Yeah, so people with autism are just as interested in sex as anybody else, actually. They are less likely to be conventional about it. They're more fluid in gender orientation or presentation sometimes. But sex is an interest. Affection might not be as easy. It depends. It depends on their sensory issues and autistic people tend to have, more either hypersensitivity or hyposensitivity, more or less sensitivity. And that, of course, affects how close you want to be to somebody, the kind of way you want to touch them or you want them to touch you. So that all has to be taken into account in your relationship.
Yeah. And again, that make the implicit assumptions explicit and explore what's possible and what each person wants. And that kind of gets me to a set of harder questions, which is there's a big decision that every couple has to face, whether there's a neurodiverse issue or not, which is, do you love your partner more than you struggle with their most difficult behaviors? And when it comes to couples who are so different and who may operate really differently, who may want a different level of affection, a different level of, warmth and talking about like feelings or a different comfort with going out and socializing, that we may have to do more accepting. And so I'm curious whether you ask couples that directly and how you sort of explore like what are people's bottom lines and what they need in our close relationship.
I don't usually have to ask them directly because when they come, they're stating it directly. A lot of times I can't live if they don't change. But then when they come to understand different things, that changes a lot of times. Not always. A lot of times people want to blame the neurodiversity on the incompatibility that they have. Mm-hmm. And it isn't usually the neurodiversity. It is the differences between them, but some of it they already knew. You already knew your partner may have been like quirky or really into history, and you were so enamored by that. Now it gets on your nerves. But somewhere in the middle, you could find that person who you fell for, and they could also make adjustments. So I think that most relationships are worth fighting for. You're there for a reason. But sometimes if something is really, really important to you, if you just have to have a certain level of affection or talking, like if you just feel like you're dying inside because your partner doesn't talk as much as you want them to, then you're not compatible. There's nothing wrong with that partner or you. You're not compatible. It's hard to watch couples like kind of try to bang each other's head against the wall trying to be somebody different. Yeah. When they're both lovable people, just not working for each other.
Yeah. I love so much of what you said, and I want to pick a couple of threads from what you just said. One is that, and I think this is kind of true throughout your book and true throughout our conversation that I really love, and I make this mistake a lot, and so I'm kind of glad that you're bringing this lens of, we get so caught up in the labels of like you are autistic or you are neurodiverse or you're neurotypical or you have depression, but people are just people, right? And they have needs and they have ways of being and they're kind of quirky. All of us are. And so if we kind of move away from the diagnostic category and just say like, this is a person and they are a particular way and I love them and they drive me crazy and what's possible, that's just a lot more of a loving approach. And the other piece that I just wanted to pull out is that I really so appreciate that you're pointing out that sometimes it turns out that a relationship just fundamentally can't work for us for whatever reason, and that we can relate to that inability to persist in this relationship in like a compassionate, accepting way without vilifying one another, without pathologizing one another, and just recognizing that, hey, it didn't work, but we can both still recognize that we're decent, good, lovable people. And I have to sort of echo, like I often feel that way. Like I'll see a couple in my office and they're hurting each other so much, right? Mm-hmm. And neither of them is bad. And both of them are valid in what they want. And it's so sad, to see. And like, I don't personally feel like I love relationships. I'm such a romantic at heart. I'm always like, oh, maybe it could work. And I try to help them. But To me, it's okay for a couple to part ways, but my good outcome is, can they continue to see one another's humanity and sort of see the good, hold on to positive regard for one another, even if they decide to part ways, that's a perfectly good outcome.
Yeah. In neurodiverse relationships, a lot of times, the autism gets thrown at the person. Well, you're autistic. That's why, you're autistic. That's why you can't do a thing. And really, well, you're neurotypical. That's why you can't do the thing. That's also why it's not working, because your brain isn't morphing around the other person's brain and theirs isn't morphing around yours. So yeah, it could be hard to watch sometimes, but also it could be great when you see them coming together, right?
Yeah, it is really cool to help people. I mean, one of the things that I think people who don't do the kind of work that we do don't realize is that couples therapy is really effective. It's been shown in randomized controlled trials to really help people who have these really sticky differences and conflicts figure out a path forward to a relationship that is a lot more loving and satisfying. And they're not different people, but they learn some tools. And I'm curious for you, what are some of the favorite tools that you've taught people that have been helpful in allowing them to navigate more skillfully some of their differences?
I just want to go back for a second. You were talking about working with couples. And in the beginning of my career, I hated working with couples.
Oh, really?
I really did not like it at all. I wanted to work with individuals, which I did. Why did you not like it? I didn't like that they didn't like each other and they said bad things and they were so mean. And I was like, I don't want to be in the room with this. But now I so love it. And what changed was I was seeing individuals. And of course, individuals come in and what do they talk about? They talk about their partner, or they talk about wanting one or looking for one, wishing they had one and then having one. And then they talk about that. So it's like, okay, bring in the partners because this is the only way this is going to work. But then it got to be really challenging in a fun way. And this kind of problem solving and finding ways to work that out in the room just became actually something I love to do now. So that really changed. So to get back to your question, what was it?
Well, I'll just reflect. I love that your point, you just have so much more to work with. If somebody is frustrated in a relationship, bring the relationship in, right? That gives you all the juice, right? You can throw tools, you can get both perspectives, you can try something different in the room as a small experiment. And it's a really powerful thing to have the relationship in the room and be able to kind of work with all the participating partners. And,
also, with autistic partners, if their partner isn't in the room, you really don't get a lot of information about the relationship. Even when they first come in, a lot of times the one person wants to say, so, tell her how our week went. And the other one's like, yeah, I thought it went well. I think we're doing well together. And, the other one is like, what? Are you kidding me? You missed all these things and all this stuff was happening and you're saying this is great. So if you just see one person, sometimes you just hear yeah, so the relationship is good. Let me talk about work because that is important. But sometimes it's at the expense of the relationship and they don't even realize it.
Yeah, that's so true. But I will say, now I'm going off into couples therapist la land. But one of the things that I find so fascinating, and just as a side note, as a couples therapist, I often have two individuals that are in individual therapy, and I'll often reach out to the individual therapist to, consult. And what I often find is that both of the individual therapists have a totally different perspective on the relationship, who's at fault, what needs to happen, what's possible to happen than I do, right? So they're different from each other and they're also different from me because they only have the perspective of their individual client. And so you might just in terms of like amount of information, get less from an autistic person. But I think either way, you get such different information.
For sure. Yes. Yes. When I work with other people and we confer on a case, let's say, it's often very different what you get when you see the couple. Sometimes you talk to somebody and they're like, so what's with, their partner? Are they just like crazy, wild, always screaming? And they're not a screamer at all. Like, what?
I think to me, it sort of reflects on just a human condition of something that's very true about the way that human understanding works, which is like we think we have better access to understanding a complex situation than we often do. And that is true regardless, right? Like you could have this piece of information or that piece of information, but it's your information. It feels truer than the other person's.
Yeah.
So we had been talking about this question of like, do you love your partner more than you struggle with their most difficult behaviors? But you also make the very important point, and you made it at the beginning of our conversation, that there are some red flags that tell you that a relationship has crossed from difficult into genuinely unhealthy. And I wonder if you can share some of those signs that people can be attentive to, that this is no longer a healthy relationship to be in.
Well, sure. And I want to say that those red flags are usually have nothing to do with autism or neurodiversity. There are things like abuse or, name calling and yelling. And like when your conflict consistently starts just hitting below the belt. Some people get to a point where every time a conflict comes up, they get so mean and nasty and abusive towards each other or one towards the other. And that's definitely a red flag. You need help. And if someone doesn't want to work on that, that's a red flag for the relationship. A loving partner, even when they're upset or hurt, will try to listen or at least still be nice to a point. And if they can't be, if there's so much resentment or so much negativity back and forth, again, you need help, and maybe you need to reconsider if you can't get past some of those things.
Yeah. So there are some signs that a relationship might not be a healthy one. But to your point, they're often have nothing to do with autism. They're sort of signals inside of the relationship that the relationship has gotten to a very unhealthy point.
Any kind of person can be abusive, or any kind of person can, push boundaries that you ask them over and over and over again not to. It doesn't matter what kind of brain they have.
Yeah.
So
I'm curious if there's any piece of wisdom or optimism that you would leave somebody who is in a neurodiverse relationship in terms of like, what are the possibilities of growing a relationship across such significant neurological differences?
Well, I have a lot of optimism about that. That's why I wrote about it. That's why I work with it. It could be great. It could be even more special than you can imagine. I've seen that, and I love that. And just somebody listening right now, or somebody reading these things, or somebody just trying, that is so hopeful right there. And I would say working on listening and trying to understand can really start a whole spiral of change.
That's beautiful. Well, the book is Autism and the Two of Us. Cindy, where can people go to find out more about you and your awesome work?
Well, my practice has a website, which is alternativechoices.com. The book itself is coming out through Guilford Press, so they have a free chapter right now, and I believe the softback will be out the first week of July, and then there's a hardback the first week in August.
We'll link to the book in the show notes, and we'll link to your website in the show notes. Thank you so much. This was such a fun conversation. I love talking to other couples therapists. It's my happy place. So thank you so much for joining me. And I'm so grateful that people like you are out there helping people in complicated relationships, because we need that kind of wisdom and guidance.
Well, thank you so much. It was fun talking to you as well.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. You can now listen to our podcast ad-free by becoming a supporter on Patreon. You can link to Patreon on our website or go to patreon.com/offtheclocksite.
If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review and sharing this episode with a friend or an enemy who would enjoy it.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our fabulous newsletter on Substack. Or if you're still addicted to social media, find us on Instagram and LinkedIn.
We'd like to thank our rockstar production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
Now for the boring part. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.